Note before I start that I am going to be talking about what happens in For the Future. If you do not want to hear what happens in this episode at this point, I'd suggest clicking away. Alright? Alright. For the Future is a fascinating and often surreal episode of The Owl House. It is an episode that depicts a world in ruin. A world that, while a bit macabre and grotesque, has had a sense of continuity to it, a sense of community to it, that has provided a source of meaning. And now that meaning is gone, Belos tried to commit genocide on the people of the Boiling Isles. Thankfully, that did not succeed, but even now, with the triumph of the Collector, the world is in a sort of degradation, a sort of deracination, an uprooting from what was normally expected. Obviously, that does not mean much to someone like Camilla, who is new to this world and does not understand its norms, but to someone like Luce, who has made this world her home, who has idealized it to some extent, who has ultimately realized beyond this idealistic stage that she genuinely loves this world and cares about it enough to fight for it despite her doubts about whether she wants to stay here long term. There is a more fundamental sense of displacement, of a fracturing of what she had known and what she had expected. The Collector is not malicious. He is not this cackling, megalomaniacal villain. This episode makes that very clear, that the Collector is a child with a child's playful enthusiasm and a child's willful disregard for the well-being of others outside themselves. All that is made very bluntly clear. I do appreciate the recognition we see of a distance between this Collector and his race, it seems like, which isn't here anymore. This race seems to be these cosmic, somewhat godlike figures who played with the world to their whims and demanded fealty and reverence, like we see the Titan Trappers devoting to the Collector. The Collector is a bit capricious, but he lacks that sense of profound self-regard that these Titan Trappers had, and that their gods, it seems, the Collectors had. He just wants to not be alone. And the show, which has always been on the side of lonely people, trying desperately to establish some source of connection and cohesion, if they are willing to actually fight for it. The Collector is not some sort of cold, brutal, ruthless figure. There is, for the show, a clear division between him and Belos. Belos is someone whom we see actively doing everything in his power to corrode the triumphs of Luz and to destroy the beautiful, thriving civilization that exists on the Boiling Isles because he is powered by pure malice and pure venom and pure viciousness. There was, it seems, a genuinely thoughtful, if misguided person inside him once, but no more. He has decayed. He has degraded. He has become more than anything this vengeful spirit, only possessed by a desire for vengeance, like you see often in a lot of cultures' depictions of wandering ghosts who can't pass on, but I think especially of Japanese depictions, especially those in no theater. There is no personality anymore. There is only this desire for vengeance that can't quite be quelled. The collector simply wants a sort of control, not in a megalomaniacal way, but in a childlike way, of trying to attain some sense of certainty and security and causality in a world that appears so random and so cruel to him. The collector is going to need to accept the fundamental principle that is promoted by Montaigne, drawing from Heraclitus and many others, that being, of course, that the world is in this inevitable process of fluctuation, of transience, that trying to fix a single, clear, orderly definition to it is a folly. It is a reasonable folly that, if it were a manageable process, would bring a sense of cohesion, a source of meaning and clear purpose, but it's not. The world is in the state of transience, the state of perpetual coming into being and fading, and attempting to deny that, attempting to enforce one's own individual will on that world to prevent any change that goes against one's own perspective and one's own wanting, as understandable as those wantings might be, is somewhat authoritarian. The collector, who is far more of a lonely kid than someone who wants to dominate others, can perhaps be made to accept this Montaigne-like sense of transience, this sense of the world being a world of experience, a world where we constantly need to observe and analyze what is passing away and coming into being if we are to gain a sort of experiential knowledge that allows us to maintain a clear sense of self and a clear sense of understanding. It is a much less permanent and a much less metaphysically glorious sense of purpose, but it is more true because it is in line with the world that is constantly in this process of change, in this process of constant revision, of knowledge constantly being made, of identity constantly being in flux through moments and sensations that are not simply transient passing things, but have this fundamental transformative value that makes the world what it was not before. There's this fundamental sense of kinetic energy, of vitality to the world that prevents any clear and unyielding perceptions of what it ultimately atemporally is. By trying to enforce this rigid, static, solipsistic conception of what the world should be, the collector is going against these inevitable processes, these natural processes. Belos has a strange position in this episode. I was quite curious as to how the show was going to treat him, because now that Hunter, despite being scarred by Belos, has gained a sort of triumph over him, there does not seem to be a reason why Belos is still in this show. I do not know how they will handle him in the last episode. But the point of Belos here is his corrupting influence on the collector. Of course, if the collector knew what he was planning, the collector, who is no friend of Belos, would not hesitate to obliterate him as absolutely as occurred previously. But Belos, even as this ghost-like monster possessed only by lingering rage from centuries of built-up hatred, is quite clever. He is attempting to trick the collector, but of course what's as important is how he is attempting to trick the collector. He is attempting to create this sense of paranoia, this sense of anxiety in the collector's mind, the sense that all those around him do not really care about him and are only out to exploit him for their own purposes. True being in the world, true understanding and testing and adapting to one's environment requires a fundamental trust in others, not an idealized trust, but a trust that people are ultimately understandable to an extent, and that the interactions between the self and others can be productive and produce knowledge and a greater sense of learning and understanding. What Belos is attempting to do is distort the collector's image of others with his illusions that fundamentally line up to Belos' own viewpoints. These viewpoints that you can only trust yourself, that you are this solipsistic individual, and that if you are to attain any sort of catharsis, you need to exercise power over others because those others are ultimately antagonistic toward you. They're ultimately in your way of getting what you want. This is the mindset of an authoritarian. It is the mindset of a zealot. It is the mindset of one who does not adhere to the Montaignian sense of the self as constantly in revision, constantly in flux through these new sensations and new ideas and new experiences, but rather the constantly changing world is an enemy and it must be forced under control by a strong authoritarian will. Luce is then left in a difficult position. She is left in the position of having to attain some source of passion, some sense of desire enough to propel her to revivify this broken world. This is her world. This is the world that has meant so much to her. It is a world that she is ultimately connected with in a far more profound and fundamental way than she was able to connect with life on Earth. Camilla understands this, and this deep sense of connection that Luce experiences is a major reason why Camilla is so enthusiastic and so ardent that Luce remain on the Boiling Isles, or at least not completely abandon the Boiling Isles to return to Earth. Whatever idealistic, abstract goals Luce believes her willingness to repress her own desires will fulfill. Ultimately, Luce needs to accept, as does the collector, as do these other characters, that the world is always changing. From an abstract standpoint, that's simple, but that's the point. It's not abstract. It is experiential. It's visceral. The self, the environment, relations with others, social mores and values, all of this is in a constant state of transition and flux. And trying to cling to a source of control, a source of ultimate certainty, while it might seem appealing, is, in the end, pointless. It is a poor bulwark against the raging, writhing, wild, and yet beautiful river of change, of the world of experience, of new sensations, new passions, and new potential opportunities that can only be understood through close examination and drawing conclusions based on actual experience, instead of trying to hold on to these rigid, too dogmatic perceptions of what's best for oneself and others. If Luce is to engage in this T.S. Eliot-like process of revitalizing the wasteland, of restoring this fixed, rigid, warped world that has been distorted to the collector's will. What she needs to be able to do is overcome the same sort of challenges and difficulties that the collector needs to overcome. The parallels between her and the collector may not be as obvious as those between her and Belos, but these are ultimately parallels about transcending one's own understandable but ultimately futile commitment to complete constancy, to complete certainty and stability, and accepting this element of unpredictability, of not trying to enforce one's will on a strange world, but accepting the strangeness of that world and all the wonders and dangers of its relationships. It is a difficult task, but Luz can do it. Let's hope the collector can as well. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more videos like this. Keep watching The Owl House. I do believe that the show has the potential to become known as one of the foremost animated shows of the last 10 years if it manages to stick the landing in this last episode. That's quite impressive. But we will see what happens. So anyway, tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon. Promise you that. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.